You gloriously miserable accursed, we're back. How was your holiday break? I want to thank you for all your patience. Joe took a mini hiatus because I was down in the Caribbean doing some important rum reconnaissance work. It was a comprehensive assignment. I hope to share my findings here as soon as I remember what they were. Scott, Kory, Jordan, did you have a good break?
Yes, very much so.
Sure. You bet.
Yeah, excellent. All right, everybody's full of vim and vigor to get back at it. Lots to talk about this week. Political figures and former political figures have come out of the holidays with guns blazing. Bill Morneau has been talking about his book, launching in about a week, about his time as finance minister and his non-relationship with the prime minister. We'll pull that apart for a while. Our cursed clipping is Conrad Yakubuski in the Globe on the government's ever so close relationship with the McKinsey consultants. Are the feds all too dazzled by a management consultant mentality? And then a timely post-holiday discussion on Canadian travel chaos and what Minister Alghabra is or isn't doing about it. And then Mr. Pinsent will remind us that we've overstayed our welcome and it's time for the Hey Yous. Jordan, Scott, Kory, let's get right into this because people have been waiting. You know they've been waiting for this. Yeah, bated breath. So listen, Morneau. He's been doing, I was away, but I noticed that he's been doing a round of interviews promoting his book. It's part tell-all, part big thoughts about the future, as these books always are. I remember Jim Coots when Don Johnson wrote a book called Up the Hill in 1984. Jim Coots said that what he learned from the book was that every good decision the government made, Don Johnson was instrumental to, and every bad decision, Don Johnson was out of town and not consulted. Anyway, people are only interested in the tell-all part of it. Scott, what have we learned from these interviews so far?
Well, not much. I mean, look, I'm damning, as you know, on the issue of tell-all political biographies. We've talked about it before on the pod. I really dislike this idea that you're provided with the privilege of playing inside a government. You get to witness and watch conversations, policy decisions, the sausage making, and then to turn around and say, here's what went down. Here's my self-interested version of that. This is why I, as you joke about Don Johnson, was super instrumental in all that mattered, but had nothing to do with the things I disliked. But on top of that, so as a species, I dislike this kind of book. I think it does augur more toward the tell-all. But what on top of all that, what bothers me about this book is there's a real sort of smugness to it. There's this sort of, it's lathered with this tone of superiority, like, oh my God, if only we could take the politics out of the political process. And it's just so like, God, I alone was striving to find the obviously correct policy remedy, and everybody else stood in my way. And even still they are. And my God, if we can't get to internal trade barriers and a higher rate of productivity and blah, 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 conventional wisdom. And it drives me bananas. And so what I really find obnoxious, and Kory and I were on Question Period talking about this with Vashi the other day, like Bill Morneau is being utterly disingenuous in this book. Now, there may be all kinds of problems in the way in which the prime minister and his office interact with cabinet ministers. There may have been all sorts of criticism you wish to make. I don't find it terribly difficult to believe that the prime minister's interest in economic matters is fleeting and inconsistent, all those sorts of things. But you can't get there in a legitimate discussion if you're going to first skip over the fact that it wasn't some fundamental point of principle that provoked your resignation. It was the WE scandal. All right, that's what happened with Bill Morneau. But to read this book, you would have thought that, he referred to it as inevitable that they would part ways. But it was, it was due to this long simmering dispute. And his most principal argument to demonstrate his case during
he didn't walk in and resign. He walked in and got fired.
You think he would have marched in and said, "My God, I just can't hack it anymore. You're simply not doing what's right for the country. You're failing to follow the correct economic and fiscal program." He didn't do any of that. It was because he got caught up in the wake of scandal, and that's being retconned now. But in addition to that, he's also the policy argument that he makes, like the illustration, exhibit number 1 in his prosecution of his own former government, is that the prime minister undermined him on the wage subsidy. The wage subsidy response initially that came out of Morneau in the finance department was so wholly inadequate.
We were screaming at him on this podcast, you and I.
Absolutely screaming. I was sending emails to anyone and everyone I could. I can remember talking to people at the time saying, I can't believe this, at a 10% rate. And he presents this as though he was doing the responsible thing. And I sort of look at it and say to myself, well, thank God the Prime Minister's office or PCO or somebody, for Christ's sake, stepped in and said, let's rewrite this thing, because he and the department had wholly misunderstood the scale and scope of the challenge that confronted the country and the globe and tailored a program accordingly. And yeah, it had to get rewritten. That's not an example of these assholes in the Prime Minister's office and the Prime Minister undermining the Finance Minister. That's an example of somebody saying, sorry, this check and balance is being exerted because you guys are trading in conventional wisdom and status quo policymaking, and that's not simply going to meet the moment.
Jordan? You're not the Trudeau apologist that Scott is, so you probably have more sympathy. You probably have more sympathy for Morneau's perspective, don't you?
Yes, the poor, sad, rich man who had no concept that people could think that $40,000 was enough to buy influence. For me, this book just confirms that Morneau is absolutely as out of touch as everybody suspected that he was, those of us external to government. And I think, to lay on top the sanctimony that he does when he is just offended to see politics happening, basically, is just ridiculous. And really, to me, this is confirmation that he didn't get it. He never got it. He was never going to get it. And the points of view that he is expounding in this book, a lot of them are pretty laughable. I do think that one particularly telling piece is, of course, his divergence on the pension stuff. This is the party ran on this in 2015 in terms of going back to 65. And for him to be opposing that when that was clearly something he signed up to run on is maybe the most damning piece that shows that he doesn't understand the fundamentals of how politics works. I do think that, and I was talking with friends last night and trying to kind of come up with one positive legacy piece of his time as finance minister, which is not easy because, of course, I think the first answer that I would come to, maybe not dissimilar to Scott, is that the best thing he did was get out of the way in the first 6 months of COVID before he resigned and actually allow some sizable measures to come through. But he did do some work on the CPP enhancement with the provinces. And
he had to be dragged kicking and screaming by Kathleen Wynne to do that. The fact that he's now claiming that as a signature accomplishment bugs me more than anything.
She set up an independent pension plan in Ontario, fully staffed, and started structuring and running it before he finally dragged his ass into action.
And you're going to make my point for me, which is that if that's your highlight, and people had to pull you to it, it's not great. So when you're writing your own book, you want to make sure that you're telling that compelling narrative of what it is that you did was wonderful. And I don't think that he really got there. And the last thing I'll say is I think that it really, people who come from extraordinary wealth really, I think, struggle in politics sometimes. And this is a great example of that. Morneau.
Hey. Look at David. It took him forever to get his balance.
How in touch could David be, right? But Morneau, this is a guy who
Some guy on Twitter said I look homeless.
That's just putting your money to work.
Homeless with a tan from the Caribbean, so this is doing all right.
Yeah, you're way too tan to be homeless at this time of year.
But this is a guy, so Morneau was a guy who was known to, in stakeholder meetings, utter phrases such as money is no object and things like that, and I think that there is certainly a stream of thinking within the Liberal Party and certainly within the Conservatives that bringing in folks like Morneau with strong private sector experience that come from knowledge of money and knowledge of managing money is inherently a benefit to the government's ethos around these things. And I think that he is just an absolute case in point about why that is not always a good solution and why having somebody who comes from such a rarefied bubble of Canadian society can actually be an enormous political liability. So I think that at the end of the day, this book kind of confirms all of everybody's worst suspicions about Morneau. I don't actually think it's that damaging for Trudeau, although it does raise questions about his relationship with cabinet, which I think we'll talk more about.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, yikes. Maybe better not to have written this one.
Yeah, well, I mean, unless you hung out with him unless you hung out with Morneau in the Young Presidents Club, Ralph Goodale was the obvious choice to be the finance minister. You shouldn't put somebody who's never been in Parliament before, never been in politics before, into that job. Anyway, leaving that aside, Kory, I want to pull apart some of the underlying threads of what Morneau's been saying, but do you want to take it back to him for a couple of minutes? Just a freestyle?
Oh, yeah. Well, sure. Yeah.
Go, Negan.
I'll give the most. I think I was a lot more damning than you were the other day on this one, Scott. But the biggest critique, I think, of Trudeau is actually the one that you just mentioned, David. And it's one that is certainly unintentional in Morneau's writing of it. The critique is, why the hell would you appoint this guy finance minister in the first place? Like, I don't think he made a good candidate to even be an MP, particularly. Like, he has no background in politics. He certainly has no aptitude for politics or political communications, at least not that I've ever seen. And then to put him in such an important role is just flirting with disaster. And disaster is more often than not what they got, at least in terms of the comms side of the role. But, it's an ode to political obliviousness, written by a very inconsequential finance minister that Ottawa, that had, I think, very little impact in Ottawa in his time there, especially given the size of the role that the finance minister should occupy. I don't think he's going to be missed by anybody. I don't think anyone's going to pick up this book 5 months from now, let alone 5 or 10 years from now, to read it and try and find some observation of value. He's a small player who wrote a small book that's full of small, petty, vengeful statements and score settling.
So here we are in the second week of January. I've just returned from a vacation in a climate where rum is pretty much considered a native crop. Glorious. Given those two factors, rum and time off, I've had an opportunity to do a little reflecting as we wind up our messaging on giving season from our presenting sponsor, TELUS. We talk a hell of a lot about it around this time of year, but giving isn't really a seasonal activity, eh? More of a year-round thing for all good people I know, and it's absolutely that way for TELUS. As I've talked about here before, giving is a core value with them, and it comes in thousands of forms. From major charitable programs and corporate donations to the countless hours of community service their people devote themselves to. The TELUS Future Foundation is a major example of how they live their values. It's an independent registered charity that believes all youth, regardless of circumstance, deserve an equal opportunity to reach their full potential. They launched it with a huge endowment in 2018 to support all admin costs for all time, so the foundation can direct every penny of every donation it receives to deserving local charities in Canada. Over 500 each year, providing different forms of education or health services, many of those enabled by technology. In 2022 alone, 548 individual grants, adding up to more than $10.5 million. Since inception, over $35 million in grants. The human impact of all this is, well, huge. Over 2 million youth in communities across the country are being helped. So happy January, Hurly-Burlyites. You can always learn more, or if you're so inclined, give to the good works of the TELUS Friendly Future Foundation at friendlyfuture.com.
David,
okay.
Dave, just before you jump into something more specific on this, I just want to make one more general point, because I've had some pushback since Kory and I were on question period the other day. And part of the pushback is, this is what's wrong with you guys as a breed. The Herles, the Jordans, the Korys, the Reids. Because you evaluate everything through the transactional lens of minute-by-minute politics. So he was a shitty politician, and therefore you say he was a failure at this, and you dismiss his observations out of hand. And I just want to make the argument that I certainly think he was a shitty politician. I think he was almost inept as a politician.
That goes without saying.
Look at
the Wee scandal. Like, not only did he blow up his career, he blew up the entire fucking charity. That's how inept he was.
Yeah,
like,
he left it.
He does feel badly about that, though.
Oh yeah. I'm sure he's donated lots of money to try to fix it.
But there's an underlying hubris to the counter argument, which is, well, you guys aren't looking at the more substantive things. He's concerned with these more weighty matters that are getting overlooked by you guys that just are in the greasy till of politics. No. But understand something. I just want to say that, like, you are going to encounter cabinet fractions. You're going to encounter tensions with the Prime Minister's office. You're going to encounter political hurdles with the provinces. The task of a successful finance minister is that you're able to navigate those challenges, manage through them politically by dint of communication skill, by dint of negotiation, behind the scenes, in front of the camera, all of those skills, put them together so that you can still, nevertheless, in the arena that in which policy is executed, succeed. And guys like Paul Martin, and let's be fair, Jim Flaherty and others, Michael Wilson, they did succeed in mobilizing all those skills and all those tools, and Morneau did not. So that's why
let's leapfrog from that into just one aspect of this, Scott, which is the role of the wage subsidy issue and the increasing role of the Prime Minister's office. So, first of all, I think we can agree it's a very centralized government.
Yes.
And that the PMO is a very important decision maker in most things. But the PMO always has the ability, the Prime Minister always has the ability to intervene with the finance minister, and sometimes they need to because they've got a bigger political perspective, generally at play, especially than the Department of Finance. The Department of Finances never wants to spend money. So their first instinct is to deny that anything is necessary to be done. And then when you force them to do something, they want to construct a program that doesn't actually cost anything. So it looks like it will do something, but it won't actually do something. And we've seen this on things like the RESPs in our history, Scott.
Yes.
Right? And so sometimes
design something that can't be utilized, so the fisc is actually never contaminated.
Right. Exactly. Sometimes you've got to overrule them and do that. And sometimes the PMO's political instincts are better. One of the biggest showdowns that Paul Martin had was mostly Jean Chrétien let Paul Martin do what he wanted to do. They had a couple of big showdowns. Sometimes Paul was right. Once Chrétien was right, in my view, when he wouldn't let Paul raise the age of eligibility for the OAS.
Yeah. Seniors benefit play.
This was the creation of the seniors benefit, right? And Chrétien said, no, we actually not going to go that far on this thing. And I think politically, especially with the referendum coming, he was right about that. So it's not unprecedented for the PMO to step in and overrule finance.
Yeah, but Morneau's not in that tradition. This is another thing that bugs me. People sort of say, well, I've had people kind of casually say to me, well, this is nothing new. Paul Martin and Chrétien obviously had their tensions. Morneau did not voice any of these objections during the time. He gave no indication that he was having these battles. I could see no evidence of battles that he won or lost or even waged. So I don't think he earned the right to be included in the same sentence as those former finance ministers who did have those tensions. And so I just find the whole thing puzzling.
Yeah. Morneau seemed to view this as a paper exercise, right? Like where having, the best policy conceptually that the finance department thought would be the most stable in the long run was the winning play. But the game is politics. He was playing absolutely in a different arena in which he seemed completely incapable of knowing what the goal actually was. And I think, David, to your example about the wage subsidy, the PMO did the right thing there. You have to remember at that moment, Canada coming out with a 10% wage subsidy was a joke. Other countries in Europe, around the world, they were well over 70%, and businesses were looking at 10% and laughing. This would have been a completely inappropriate policy. And so the PMO was right to step in. And the fact that he shows absolutely no understanding of that in the book, I think tells you everything you need to know.
Okay, Kory, can I come to you on something specific?
Sure. Yeah, of course.
All right. The relationship between the Prime Minister and his ministers. So, and I think it flows from what Scott and Jordan were saying in the sense that Morneau didn't fight maybe the way we would expect a minister to fight on some things, and there was lack of communication, but he appears to have had no relationship with Trudeau, like none. like had never met with him one-on-one, had never been with him without staff present. And I hear the same thing from other people who've been in that government and are still there or have left, that is always the case, that there's always staff and nobody has any individual relationship with the Prime Minister whatsoever. That's extremely strange and, in my view, wholly unprecedented. Like even Paul and Kretschmer had a relationship. Fuck, they knew each other for years and years and years, right? So what does this tell you about how the government is being run? And what are the implications of a government where the ministers have their relationships, frankly, with PMO staffers and not with the Prime Minister?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm less disturbed by that, to be honest, and certainly, I would say that Harper certainly was more like Trudeau in this respect, not someone whose relationships with his cabinet and MPs was primarily personal in nature. It was always business and often involved staff being present. In fact, almost always. I think it can come down to just that element, whereas a Mulroney, really ran that government and kept the government together and the caucus and the cabinet together through the force of his own personality and his relationship with the people within the party. But that's seemingly from afar. You guys would know better than I. Not the approach that Trudeau takes in managing those relationships. It certainly is not the forte of Harper or his approach, and both can work very well. Like I don't think anyone would say that Harper was a poor manager because he wasn't spending a lot of alone time talking about what ex-cabinet ministers' kids were up to on the weekend. Like it's just not how he is, and who cares? So I don't think it's that big a deal. But I think all of this comes down to just one thing, and we've talked about this before around campaigns and all kinds of other stuff, and it's that politics is a team sport first and foremost, and you have to be able to work well with others. You have to be integrated into that. The thought that any minister is going to come in and own their own portfolio and be able to say, "Oh, this is my part of the agenda where I'm responsible for. Everyone else, get the hell away. I'm the expert here. My role was to look after the finances. Everyone else back off." Like, it's just such a fundamental miscomprehension of what politics is and how government works. And if that's your viewpoint, you're best not to get involved at all, because you're going to be very disappointed and you're not going to do a good job.
Jordan, do you find it strange that the ministers, even senior ministers, don't have personal relationships with the Prime Minister or get one-on-one time with the Prime Minister, whether it's in an office to discuss an issue or whether it's over dinner? So
I think, I've worked with leaders who have both styles, and I think that maybe similar to Kory, I think both can work. But it changes what the dynamic is like within caucus and within, the leader's office. If you have a leader who is very hands-on by their own personality and brings along strong personal relationships, then I think in a lot of ways that can be a more efficient way to keep the team together. That can certainly be a more organic way to keep people motivated and on the same page. But on the other hand, if you have somebody who by their nature, they treat it more as a business relationship and they don't have those strong personal relationships, I think you can work around that. But inherently, you're going to end up with a much more muscular leader's office where staff take a much larger role in managing those relationships and therefore in being present during those meetings. And you're going to have just a less of a one-on-one relationship. I think you can work that way. You can do it. I've seen it done. I've seen it work. It tends to be, I think, maybe a little more painful in some ways because you're not trading on lots of internal goodwill. But you can make a go of it. So I'm not sure that I would be necessarily alarmed that Trudeau and Morneau didn't have a buddy-buddy relationship. But what I would be attentive to overall is whether or not that system is working for this PMO? Is that system still working for this prime minister? Are they still able to kind of grease things along using a strong central staff team to kind of extend the prime minister's influence outwards in a way that isn't like broadly resented by his caucus? That's kind of the question.
Well, Jody Wilson-Raybould was maybe more of an example of, where the lack of a personal relationship caused the whole thing to blow up. But if there's a case in Morneau's musings on politics, for that being the case in his instance, I don't see it. If they'd had a better personal relationship, would he have been in less trouble for taking $40,000 to go on a trip from the We Charity? There's not a conflict point here. Where,
no, but finance minister is a lonely job. Right. And Steve Paikin, in his recent book on John Turner, points out that Turner, even though Turner actually had a personal relationship with Pierre Trudeau, from going to midnight mass together to odd vacation together and had hung around the cabinet together for years, didn't feel that he knew the prime minister had his back. Didn't feel that he had that confidence that he could do his job knowing the prime minister would back him up. That's pretty important, I think, when you're the finance minister. Scott?
Yeah, see, I think you're getting at something there that is more where my thinking, or at least maybe my questions, start to swirl around. I don't think it's just about managerial style, because I totally accept what Kory is saying, is that you'll have different personal managerial styles, and so some people are going to play the personal card, call you on your birthday, more than say other leaders who might be a little bit more aloof and just transactional. It's not just that. Like, I'm not startled that, Trudeau wasn't going go-karting with Bill Morneau. Who gives a fuck, right? And I wouldn't want to go go-karting with Bill Morneau, to be entirely honest. So I'm even sympathetic to that impulse. But
Why don't you have a drink with Mitch McConnell?
Hard to find an Audi golf cart for him, Keep him in the style of which he's become accustomed.
Yeah, I think he probably races helicopters or something. I don't know. It's but yeah, go-karts is way too down market.
The picture that emerges of Trudeau, though, as prime minister is a pinch unknowable sometimes. I think that's what's kind of interesting to me. And you get these bits and pieces, the biographies that come out, and many of them are under a shadow of protest, so we're over-reliant on Morneau's tome or Jody Wilson-Raybould. But, it is that he operates a little bit differently. The guy we see on TV that you think is going to be so charismatic, seems to operate differently, more stoically, more steely, more antiseptically. I think that's interesting. So, and then it gets those questions that you say, which is, given that there's a heavy concentration of staff management, again, which is an old thing that people can go on and on about. They've been saying it since the Pierre Trudeau days. But, it does leave people. I don't know that these senior ministers know where their boundaries are. They don't know, what is my relationship? What is my standing? Like, if I go and then I say, Jesus Christ, I've got a letter here I've got an envelope here with my resignation letter in it. And if we can't agree on this issue, I'm prepared to put it on the table. I think they're kind of like, I don't know. I guess I'm an interchangeable Lego part. So maybe because they don't have any sense of it. And I'm filling in a lot of blanks here. I just don't know. I'm not in the cabinet. I'm not in the office. And the truth of the matter is, we're trying to peer into someone's marriage, right? And you don't know if you're not there. But there's something a little bit, you get hints and bits every now and then that Trudeau is a little less knowable, a little less familiar than we think he is to us.
Yeah. Some of you might remember those hoary old high school math problems about trains. One train is traveling west at 60 miles an hour and another train is traveling east at 45 miles per hour on the same track, and the student has to calculate when they'll meet. Personally, I always wondered what happens when they meet, given that, they're on the same track. Nothing good, I used to think. Anyway, as brilliant a student as I was, I didn't know much about trains. First, the math problem isn't theoretical. It's a real-life calculation that railroaders make every day. And not just once. There can be hundreds of trains on a network like CN's at any moment. And somebody has to figure out when all of them will meet. Second, of course, trains on the same track don't meet. They pass one another. And that's because of something called sidings. Think of sidings as the railroad version of the passing lanes that appear from time to time on a two-lane highway, like most of the Trans-Canada. A A siding is a stretch of parallel track that allows a train to pull over and let another train whiz by. Back in the old, inefficient days when CN was a crown corporation, its sidings were only 6,000 feet long. Nowadays, the average CN train is twice that length, 12,000 feet, which has necessitated the construction of 2-mile-long sidings across Canada and down to the Gulf of Mexico. That's cost a lot of money, but CN considers it an excellent investment and continues to build out its network, which has enabled CN's railroaders to plan passing points with tremendous accuracy, which keeps the trains running smoothly and on time, which is the prime directive. Oh, about that math problem, here's what I always wanted to ask. If a steam train is moving at 60 miles per hour and wind is blowing from behind at 60 miles per hour, does the smoke from the smokestack go straight up? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? 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 All right, let's move on from Mr. Morneau. That's enough. That's just enough. All right.
That's the most he's going to be talked about again.
Yeah, I don't think we'll ever have to mention his name again. I think we can probably live our lives quite successfully talking about politics and not have him come up.
Well, I'm actually hopeful he'll come on the Herle Burley and we'll talk about his book. So we'll see how that goes. Our clipping today, and we have sound effects for this. Our clipping is from Konrad Jakubowski in the Globe and Mail. He's not the only person who wrote about this. A few people have written about this, and it's about, I think, some numbers that were first put together by a Quebec newspaper. I apologize to the newspaper. I'm forgetting which one. About McKinsey contracts and the federal government. Let's just read a little bit about what Jakubowski had to say. McKinsey, the pedigreed consulting firm that has been plagued by a series of conflict of interest scandals spanning several countries, has been practically wedded at the hip to Mr. Trudeau's government since the firm's then global managing partner, Dominic Barton, was picked to head up Ottawa's Advisory Council on Economic Growth in 2016. Out of the supposed generosity of its heart, McKinsey provided pro bono research support to the council. We are told that this had absolutely no influence on the Trudeau government's subsequent awarding of a string of multi-million-dollar contracts to the firm, including, as the Globe and Mail reported last week, a $24.8 million deal to advise the Department of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada on transformation strategies, whatever that means. This week, Radio Canada, it's Radio Canada, not a newspaper. This week, Radio Canada arrived at its own tally of federal contracts awarded to McKinsey since Mr. Trudeau's government was first elected in 2015. While the firm earned a mere $2.2 million in federal contract work when Stephen Harper's Conservatives were in power between 2006 and 2015, it has pocketed more than $66 million in less than 7 years under the Liberals. Okay, Kory. What's going on here? Is this a patronage story? Is this a hollowing out of the civil service story? What is this? What is going on here?
It's a waste of money story. If there were fortes for the Trudeau government, it's certainly not on process management of getting stuff done for all of the what they used to call it, the
deliverology.
Deliverology. There you go. A good turn of phrase, but never really actually occurred. And there are other elements. And I think we're going to maybe talk about one of them later. But whether it's a broken air transportation system, whether it's the passport office, whether it's hundreds of millions of extra dollars going out in CERB payments to people who don't qualify at all, the government has not really done a terribly good job. And you mentioned citizenship and immigration, an incredibly broken system from a process point of view, no matter where you're coming at it from, which direction you're looking at it from. So if they're spending that kind of money,
isn't that why you hire consultants to give you advice on transformation?
They've been seemingly doing it for the better part of a decade. So, where's the fucking goods on the other side here? As I think there are a lot of other people who could tell you can hire management consultants as a way of spinning your wheels and not actually getting a whole hell of a lot done. So I guess it kind of depends on what your view on management consulting is. I myself have a very dim view of it. And I think the Harper government as a whole had a very dim view of it. And that's why you saw very little money wasted on it. This government, and I would say, pound for pound, the Harper government, a lot more outcome oriented and a lot better at actually delivering the goods. But then again, I'm maybe a bit biased on that. However, there's not a lot of indication that the money being spent on McKinsey is going anywhere other than into the fireplace or the trash can or whatever analogy you want to use. But, waste of money.
Jordan, what do you care about this story?
Oh, many things. I think the most charitable thing I'm going to say about it is that this is the Canadian manifestation of a global problem. So these management consulting firms getting into government and spreading their tentacles and becoming very hard to dislodge is something that's happening around the world. And, we've seen that happening with, in France with Macron, McKinsey running into trouble recently on some of their COVID measures. So I think that the Trudeau government is not unique in this respect, but it is a huge problem. And for a lot of the reasons that Kory mentioned, but other ones as well. So higher costs for taxpayers, crappy work, often with little oversight or accountability, no real view for Canadians into what's happening in these contracts and what sort of pull McKinsey or other firms actually have in decision making, which is a huge, huge issue. And I think that if you look back at the Radio Can story that broke this, they've got people from immigration and refugee there talking about how McKinsey was instrumental in deciding strategic direction on some of the, and frankly, an outside firm has really no business doing that. That is the job of government. And there should be direct lines of political accountability for that. So it's worrying from a democratic perspective. It's worrying from a financial management perspective. And frankly, this is why we have a civil service. And if we want to attract good people to our civil service and retain them, there has to be some sense that what they're doing is more than pushing paper along and that there can be some role in shaping the government. So every time this stuff gets contracted out and it's used to go around civil servants, it becomes problematic. But what often I think is happening here is that these consultancies are coming in and they're replicating advice that civil servants are getting. But because it's coming from a private firm, it's better received by ministers and their staff.
Okay, but Jordan, such a good point, okay? It's such a good point, but it's hardly unique to government. The number of private sector clients that I've had over the years where people in the institution have said to me, can you please tell my bosses what you just said to me? Because I've been telling it to them for years, but they'll believe it if you say it. They'll take it seriously if you say it because you're from the outside. So there's obviously a culture developed in large organizations where people think that outside consultants are smarter than the people they employ.
I would starve to death if that dynamic did not exist.
Yeah. So I think in private business, that's, obviously that's a product of, company culture, and that's a profitability problem. In government, we have a different brief, right? So in government, that's an issue because really you're effectively double paying for the same work and the same advice. And that is a problem for Canadians. And the last thing I'll say about this is I think on the political front, this isn't great for Trudeau because of the cozy relationship that McKinsey and Trudeau and Ilk have, the perception that they are getting contracts as a result of that relationship, whatever the actual truth of the matter may be, is problematic because it feeds into this idea that if you are a well-connected insider, and these management consultant firms are all full of consummate insiders and former staffers, and it's a very revolving door ecosystem there, that if you are cozy and you are part of that family, you're going to get your piece, and that is actually... These are the voices that are actually directing government action. I think that could be quite toxic, just as another brick in the wall for the Liberals on this.
So you see it as a potential patronage story?
Absolutely.
There's no question. I mean, I guess it's funny. I mean, I don't think that there's any sort of financial benefit going around. I mean, not McKinsey's getting financial benefit, but not coming back the other way in anything. I don't really, and they're not liberals. They're not supporting the party, so it's not a patronage story like that. But the government was in love with Dominic Barton from the very, very beginning. I recall at the very beginning of the mandate how he was instrumental in setting up these meetings with them with potential big investors, and there was all this Canada's back hype, and he was a big part of putting all that together. And then he's kind of the architect of the China strategy. And I mean, he's been a big part of the government.
I think there's a cultural aspect, which has an electoral implication. or at least we see it reflected, and we analyze and talk about it in our electoral analysis often, which is, I grant everything that people said. Yes, there's a lot of money, so maybe there's going to be some controversy there, and there's this element of insidery, guys that are wired, men and women who are wired because of who they are and where they come from, and all. So all of those kinds of vulnerabilities. But on that insider thing, I think there's another dimension, and it is cultural. I mean, we talk about, and there's been a lot written almost academically over the last 15 years about how, the spectrum isn't so much left and right anymore. It's not so much even socioeconomic. The demographic play is really kind of professional versus non-professional, and you see that happening. One of the blind spots for, centrist parties or center-left parties like ourselves, like Macron, are that they can, I say ourselves, like you and me, David, like I see, that they get, they get kind of captured by their own sense of professional values and norms, and that's how the world works, and therefore can't relate to folks outside of that milieu. And I think when you compound that with this notion, like, deliverology, there was this kind of like celebration of the technocratic. There's this implied sort of, we're going to do this the right way. Like, we fucking know, like, first of all, our values are such that we appreciate the climate crisis, but not only that, we have the ingenuity and the creativity. We've thought through processes. We can whiteboard this fucking thing to death. We can fix this problem, in a deck. Now, it will cost you $14 million to buy that deck, but we can do it, because that's our management consultant sort of thesis. And I just think there's a tone deafness, there's an insiderism, there's a perpetual feedback loop that doesn't break outside of itself. And I think that's a little dangerous. It's dangerous for the operation of government as an institution. I think it's dangerous for a political operation that's heading a government, because you're really putting on big multi-million-dollar blinders.
Well, you'd have to believe that all this consulting and stuff is actually going to make things better, and not just design a even more complicated Rube Goldberg machine, which is what I think is often what comes out the other end. It's either an excuse for not doing something, or a more complicated approach to doing something you're already doing, but it's not outcome driven. And I think that's one of the criticisms I would make with consulting.
Kory, it's the old joke. We received our reports from the consultants. Here's how we fix everything. Can we do this? No, we can't do that.
Yeah.
Okay,
Exactly.
We can all look forward to the day when ChatGPT can replace whatever report is being drafted by the kid 2 years out of university.
There's a whole appendix entitled "It's About Outcomes." You just have to read it.
But, all right. Well, like, if it's about outcomes, there's so many things where outcome, matters, and we've talked about this before. Like,
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm having fun.
We're all joking. We're on the same page here, and I think to me, one of the important things about this is, it's true that it is getting more and more difficult to attract people into the public service. And it's going to get even more difficult if they don't think they're decision makers or serious advisors. If they think they are procurers of consultants, that's not a very interesting job.
That's right.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Let's move on to your guys' pet peeve, which is when I asked people what they wanted to talk about today, there was a considerable view that we wanted to talk about travel chaos over the holidays. So I'll just lead off by saying that I flew back from the Dominican Republic last night. WestJet, flight landed on time. We disembarked immediately and promptly, went right to a green light, got my customs card, walked out without any delay, and my bags were awaiting for me, and I left the airport. The only thing Minister Alghabra could have done to make it more convenient is pick me up at the fucking airport.
Well, I hope you bought a lottery ticket.
What's your complaint, Jordan?
My complaint
what's wrong, bitches?
Yeah, what could be wrong? Listen, I think if you take a step back, we've reached the point now where the travel system in Canada, broadly speaking, just doesn't work anymore. If you don't live in Vancouver or Toronto or Montreal, if you live in a small size city maybe in the prairies, you're losing your air links, you're losing your bus links, at a mile a minute at this point. You have fewer and fewer options to travel. If you do happen to live in a major center and you're trying to rely on, for example, rail service to get where you need to go, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be delayed. And then you throw on what happened over the holidays. So yes, okay, I'm gonna say it's complicated, the reasons why some of this failed, but some of it's also not complicated. We have a lot of people traveling. It's Christmas and we have winter weather. Folks, this happens every year. So we have to ask the question, why are we so catastrophically unprepared for this every single season?
But why aren't you asking the airlines? Why are you asking the government?
Yeah.
Well, I'm asking the government because it seems to be a pernicious and repeating problem. And I think that Minister El Ghabra's little media tour of I'm not even going to call it contrition because he really wasn't that sorry. There was some hand waving about it's complicated and we must do better. But at the end of the day, this is a government that brought in the Air Passenger Bill of Rights legislation back in 2019. And guess what happened when that bill was being studied? Many of these problems were pointed out. It was pointed out by opposition parties that this legislation was largely toothless and wasn't actually going to be providing people proactively with compensation and with assistance in some of these situations. And lo and behold, what has happened is exactly what was predicted. So while it is perhaps not Minister El Ghabra's personal fault that there was a snowstorm, I do think that there is a political problem when we do have a clear legislative framework that sucks and needs to be fixed. And that is only now going to happen after entirely predictable events occurred that stranded people for and we should really say truly awesome amounts of time, like 18 hours on a train with no food and what, this is Banana Republic stuff, right? Can you actually say that you would book a train ticket now to go to somewhere that you needed to be on time? I don't think many Canadians would. So we're a big country. We need these services to be reliable. We need them to be affordable. We need them to actually function. And we have reached a point now where that is no longer the case. And I do think that this becomes a political problem for the government. And I think that the response so far has been wholly underwhelming. So I hope that the opposition parties are going to be on this as the committee does their hearings and really not let up until we actually get to a point where the government is playing a role in sustaining a system that works for Canadians. And that does actually mean doing things like where needed, backstopping on some of these rural bus routes that have disappeared and things like that. You see provincial governments stepping in and innovating on this. Where are the feds?
Saskatchewan government intervened by canceling their bus service. Kory, you were also wanted to talk about this, but I'm interested in your perspective because surely you don't think the government should be intervening in how the airlines manage their affairs.
I think they should be intervening and opening up the system to have more competition, to put downward pressure on prices and to create more room for, perhaps regional carriers or others that are going to service places like, say, Saskatchewan, which has in the last number of months seen a number of routes on Air Canada canceled, which is, meaning it's more expensive and harder to fly to certain parts of the country.
I don't understand that, Kory. I thought the reason that Air Canada got a monopoly on the good flights in the country, the profitable flights, was so they would service the other places. I thought it was a cross-subsidization system.
It's supposed to be, but the pro quo is missing in the quid pro quo right now. So there's different approaches that you could have on it. But it's either more government intervention in terms of actually making sure that the pro quo on the keeping foreign competition out is actually being balanced off with that regional cross subsidization, but it's clearly not. And there, I think the truth is that the Minister of Transportation has to always be course correcting on this stuff to make sure that those balances are being maintained. If you're going to maintain that system, I have, as a conservative, a low opinion of government management as a whole, and I would actually, encourage going for more free market system where that self-correction is happening more through a market-based process by having more competition. But, if we're going to keep Emirates Airlines out, if we're going to keep American carriers out of our airspace, if we're going to overcharge massively for landing fees like we do in Toronto and in Vancouver and our other major hubs, then we damn well better get good service on the other side of things to smaller centers, and we're not. I think my own view is the GTAA is incompetently managed. I think that the government. I don't think anybody's in charge there. I don't think anybody's in charge. I think it's a system where the government has handed the levers over to these local airport authorities, and it has very little ability to actually influence things on the other end. And so they're just kind of doing whatever the hell they want. And so, when you see Pearson listed as, one of the top 3 airports in the entire fucking world for delayed flights, where is the accountability? And I feel the Minister of Transportation's pain that he feels powerless because he's largely given away his power to actually intervene on these issues. So I think it's a great time for the government to either get more involved or get out of the way. But what I don't like is like where we are right now, which is just sort of nobody doing anything to fix it, and just having, as Jordan said, again and again and again, stories about, oh, winter weather. Well, look, it's winter every year. And lots of other places are winter climates, and they can seem to manage their airport a hell of a lot better than we do.
Scott, you got a quick word before Pinson kicks us out of here?
Yeah, my word would be incentives. I think, we can talk about a passenger's bill of rights, and maybe it's great that we, have the ability to demand and maybe receive some small, compensation for getting, screwed in the ass. But that's, I'd rather just not get screwed in the first place. And we can talk about more competition and all that, but I'm not actually very confident that that's going to increase uneconomic routes. I mean, the truth of the matter is that a bunch of those routes are uneconomic. And so more competition isn't going to do that. It's just going to, it's going to create more competition on the routes that exist that are already profitable, and then, probably drive out the Canadian carriers. So, to me, the big culprit here is incentives. And the challenge is that it's all about share price. Why does that deal and cross-subsidization no longer exist? Because the more they became a private sector player, the more Air Canada just said, well, we gotta be driven by the way in which the market reacts to us. And by the way, our CEO and senior management, their compensation is all tied to share performance. All of that means you're at the whim of how the market perceives your performance as an organization. And that is going to be, did you cut costs? Have you made it really, really tight? Are all of those things? And all of those things put you in a situation where when there's one snowflake, much less a million on Christmas Eve, the whole system goes to rat shit. And I don't know how you fix that problem, because the corporate world, the private sector, is not going to suddenly starve itself off of the incentive that is tied to share price and market performance compensation.
Well, there's gaming on all of that to skirt around the rules, where you will have a plane changed, or they'll have it be a weather delay when it's not, when it's actually that the plane's half empty. But there's all kinds of silly bugger being played by the airlines for sure.
But by the way,
the Canadian Transportation Agency seems industry captured too, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
and by the way, let's not forget that the Canadian government just bailed these guys out to the tune of millions and millions of dollars during the pandemic. And this could have been tied to service improvements, and it wasn't.
Right. Okay, cool. Mr. Pinsent, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
All right, Scott, coming right back at you.
My hey you is to Pierre Poilievre. Look, during one of those ridiculous, doltish leadership debates that were held, they were so abysmal. There was a question asked, what's on your nightstand? Caught flat-footed. He said, Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules in Which to Ruin Someone's Life. And so he started talking about that book and praising him. All right, whatever. He was stuck, he was ass off top of his head. Recently, just this past week, he did this online video praising Jordan Peterson, there's this whole controversy about the college and all that kind of stuff. I don't even care to get into it, all of it. My point is this. Pierre Poilievre, you got to broaden your reach. You got to broaden your appeal. I'm not certain that that's happening. I think he's been disciplined, but I don't think he's been growing. And I thought it was a really strange strategic decision to do a video that celebrates Jordan Peterson. You can say it's celebrating freedom of speech and all that kind of stuff, but ultimately you are what you talk about. And when you talk about Jordan Peterson, you're going to associate yourself with all of his arguments, all of his issues, all of his grievances. And I don't think you want to be anywhere near that. I don't think that's going to help you win seats in the Lower Mainland. I don't think that's going to help you win seats in the 905. I don't think you want to bet on how Jordan Peterson conducts himself and what things he says over the course of the next 6 months to a year. And then people can say, hey, look back at that video. Remember, he was applauding Jordan Peterson. I don't think you needed to make this video. I don't think you need to make this decision. I think it was self-indulgent and really, really unstrategic from a group of people and from a leader who, for whatever his failings are, has been quite disciplined and strategic to this point. I thought it was a real miss.
Excellent. Hey, you. All right, Kory, what's yours?
Mine is to Peter Wilkinson, who is familiar to probably some people listening to the podcast. He's coming in to be Melanie Joly's chief of staff, but Peter's background is more in provincial politics within the Liberal Party, but I've had the occasion to work with him over the years at Manulife, where he's been hanging his hat for quite some time now. But a really, really capable individual for those who have worked with him. And when you're talking about challenges of attracting talent into government, he's certainly somebody who's extremely talented and I think a huge get for the government.
Well, Jordan, I'm going to jump in because that was my hey you too. So I'm just going to augment Kory by saying I have known Peter for a long time. But what's interesting about this to me is that Melanie Joly is the Global Affairs Minister, has just introduced the Indo-Pacific strategy. And this is going to be a hugely important policy area for the government over the next couple of years. And I'm going to say here on this podcast that Melanie Joly is also, in my view, the leading contender to replace Trudeau if he were to step down. And so between those two things, Peter Wilkinson, longtime friend of mine, former client of mine, guy I worked with in the Ontario government and other places, is going to be right at the center of what's going on in Canadian politics for the next several years. That's for sure. Good luck, Peter. All right, Jordan.
My hey you's going out to Aaron O'Toole. You might have seen his blog where he's attempting, I think, some reputational repair by lamenting how distasteful and dangerous he finds all of the anti-Trudeau rhetoric and the fuck Trudeau flags and this, that, and the other. And my hey you is, wow, you know, really proving that you are not a leader because you fed that beast and it ate you. So this finding religion after it all went down, I think just absolutely underlines why he should never have been leader in the first place.
Yeah. See, Siegfried or Roy? Which one?
That was great, Jordan. It was just like having Jenny back on the pod.
All right, everybody out there, thank you for listening. Thank you for waiting for a couple of weeks and coming back to us. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. I'd like to thank Scott and Kory and Jordan for being here with me, all of you who listened or watched, and of course, Cole Caulfield, without whom there would be no reason to pay attention to hockey this year whatsoever. Take care, everybody. We'll be back next week with more Cursive Politics.